Hello and welcome to the programme from me, David Foster. 20 years as Russia's leader, and Vladimir Putin has no appetite for leaving office. So what makes him seemingly indestructible, and what changes has he brought to his own country and to the rest of the world? This is Roundtable. Do not forget that this was a man largely anonymous internationally and little known at home when he came to power, but who is now said to see himself as irreplaceable and is trying to stay in office for at least another 16 years.
President or Prime Minister, the title has sometimes changed. But for 20 years, Vladimir Putin has been in charge in Russia. Sworn in May 2000, the former KGB agent was elected as president another 3 times in 2004, 2012 and 2018. He will almost certainly run again, if or when his recent proposed constitutional changes are approved. Russia's opposition denounces the proposals as an effort to make him president for life. And during the coronavirus outbreak, Putin's approval rating has slipped to its lowest level in more than 2 decades. Critics argue that the pandemic has exposed Russia's poorly funded healthcare systems and the vulnerability of its oil industry as prices hit historic lows. Economic growth has steadily declined since Putin came to power as the country faced international sanctions and a currency crisis. But supporters of the president say he has improved Russia's standing on the world stage through an aggressive foreign policy and wars in Chechnya, Georgia, Ukraine and Syria. So what will the next 2 decades bring for Putin and for Russia?
Okay, we will be welcoming to the programme in a little while the former Russian diplomat Vyacheslav Matuzov. He's in Moscow, and in London, Victor Sebestyen, a writer and historian on Russian affairs. But right now, let us say hello to Olga Oliker, the programme director for Europe and Central Asia at the International Crisis Group, and international affairs commentator Marko Gasic. Very warm welcome to both of you. Olga, let me come to you first of all. Do you think ordinary Russians appreciate what Vladimir Putin thinks he's done to Russia?
So I think, so first of all, thank you for having me. I think it depends on which ordinary Russian you ask. And my take on it is that for a lot of Russians, there is both much to like and much to dislike about their president. And I think maybe even some concern that 20 years is quite a long time for somebody to be president. But there aren't a lot of alternatives on the horizon. And I think that is very much a big factor in how Russians look at Vladimir Putin today, that he's, you could have lived your entire life to adulthood with Putin as president of Russia.
So you're talking about 20 years up. We're talking about 20 years up to now, possibly another 16 years, and who knows what after that. Is there any possibility the Russian people not just get bored with him, but decide he's no longer the man for them?
Sure, in the sense that there are plenty of Russians who are frustrated with Putin and would like to see somebody else. The question is, how does that change? Does that change, in 2024 with Putin losing an election? Does it change in 2024 with Putin not running? Does it change at some later point in time with an election, with a health issue, with a resignation? Some people would probably like to see a revolution. But all of this depends on a system that makes it possible for somebody else to come to power. And in theory, Russia has a system that makes that possible. In practice, it's very difficult to look out at the political horizon in Russia and see anybody who is a real candidate for the job.
Marko, isn't this part of the problem? And I know you are a Putin fan, that he keeps his inner circle happy, he keeps them close so that they won't want to rebel and get rid of him.
Well, I think there's a supposition there that he should be rebelled against and got rid of. And objectively, there's absolutely no reason why that should be the case. I mean, in the 20 years he's been there, I mean, we should remember where Russia was when Putin arrived. It was in a state of utter collapse, life expectancy, health, incomes, living standards, birth rates had all collapsed. It was a terrible country. Mr. Putin came in and he reformed the whole place. And since then, we've had 20 years of relative rise, indeed great rise, some problems with sanctions and financial crises, but generally, every Russian, whether he likes Mr. Putin or not, should be extremely grateful for these 20 years that he's done. And I don't see why
Let me put this to you.
Successful.
Let me put this to you. GDP hasn't grown since 2008. A survey last year said that 48% of urban Russians believe they'll never have a decent salary. The average salary $1,000 a month. It may be slightly better than what it was, but it's not nirvana.
Well, GDP grew about 72% up to 2008 in that very same Russia. So perhaps they got a little bit spoiled by the initial improvements. But we should remember also we had a financial crisis in 2008, which President Putin had to manage and did. And we've had sanctions by the US, ostensibly because of Ukraine as well. So he's had a lot to deal with. If he's holding the ship steady, then he's doing a pretty good job. And the idea of change for change's sake, to me, seems pretty ridiculous. Just be very careful what you wish for.
Olga, let me come to you on this. I took a look at foreignpolicy.com, much respected website, and I picked some people who'd written about Putin's 20 years. First one, Angela Stent, wrote a book called Putin's World, Russia Against the West and the Rest. And she writes, Putin was determined to restore Russia to its rightful role. He was as a great power. Has he done that?
So I think the question of what makes for a great power, what doesn't make for a great power, was Russia not a great power in 1990? Anybody's guess. My own take in that foreign policy piece is to say that people in Russia look at Putin much the way the rest of the world looks at the United States sometimes, which is to say that once upon a time, possibly quite a while ago, really did tremendous things. More recently, it's a bit of a mixed bag. And for the future, could be good, could be bad. There's a lot of reason to be nervous. Maybe it would be nice to have a change after all, but there aren't a lot of alternative options. So is Russia a great power? Is Russia at the table? Yes. Has Putin played a role in that? Absolutely. Could this have been done differently? And, is it Putin alone who could have done that? I'm not so sure, but we are where we are.
Michael McFaul, who was a US ambassador to the Russian Federation 2012, I think it was, to 2014, has recently said Mikhail Gorbachev, Boris Yeltsin, even Dmitry Medvedev, to a lesser degree, have embraced more liberal ideas and saw greater cooperation with the West. Had Yeltsin chosen Boris Nemtsov to succeed him, Russian democracy might have survived and Russia's cooperation with the West might have continued. So Marko, democracy effectively died when Putin came to power. Nemtsov, of course, having lost his life in an assassination in 2015. There is no democracy.
I think that the concern for democracy, whenever we hear this stuff about democracy, I always wonder what we're actually really talking about here. If there's a national leader who shows a sign of independence, then he's immediately a problem. Elections that bring him to power might be flawed. They're viewed as obstacles to democracy. If we have an ally of us, then a flawed election is viewed as a step towards democracy. And we are very happy to have that person on board. So this concern for democracy in another country seems to be crocodile tears. I mean, we're not really concerned about democracy in a whole lot of countries, starting from Saudi Arabia and working north, south, east, and west. So why we should be sincerely concerned for the Russians and their democracy, I really have to be a little bit cynical there about our
Let me ask you about his character, both of you. Marko, you first. Why do you think he is driven to want at least another 16 years in power?
I don't know what he wants, but I do know one thing. He does feel that Russia is a targeted country. And objectively speaking, it is, because Russia has something that everybody wants, oil, and something else that everybody wants, gas. And it's a player in a multipolar world which doesn't suit those who are advocates of a unipolar-controlled Western world. So he represents independent nations which run their own affairs, which get together by treaties and make proper arrangements which they stick to, none of which are very popular qualities in the West. So that's why he wants to stay there, because he knows that that he might well be replaced by some puppet president who will do what the other side said, in effect a kind of a non-drunk Yeltsin figure who will simply appease the first firm person who comes along, and that will not be good for Russia. The aim of the game would be to divide Russia into manageable units, ultimately to split the country and destroy its cohesion. And he views himself as a kind of that cohesive figure, without after him the flood, as it were. So I think that it's a natural tendency in people who've been there for quite a while to equate the interests of the state with themselves. But in this particular case, I have to say I can see his point.
Olga, Marko mentioned there oil, and of course it is a big driver of the Russian economy, or at least it was, because we've seen oil prices absolutely plummet. I want your reflection on Yeltsin's character, what keeps him wanting to do this, and whether, in fact, he will be able to hold on to any kind of popularity if there's an economic dive caused by the problems with oil prices.
So Vladimir Putin, my own take on why Vladimir Putin has stuck around for so long it's a little different from Marko's, though I think there's some overlap. I don't think it's so much that Putin is the only one who can save Russia. I do think Putin believes he's the only one who could save Russia. And I think Putin has an inner circle that often tells him that he is the only one who can save Russia, in part because it's very dependent. The folks around Putin stay in power themselves because of Putin, right? That's not unusual. But I think if you spend 20 years being told that you're the only one who can save Russia, you probably do tend to believe it, and you look around and you don't trust the Russian people, right, to find a replacement for you. Will his popularity wane? Look, his popularity has been up and down as the Russian economy has been up and down, not entirely in line with these two things. It's not a perfect correlation. He's still fairly popular, and the public opinion polling, you can ask questions about how reliable it is, but he's reasonably popular. It doesn't mean every one of his policies is popular. In fact, the Russian government often gets criticized in these polls, even as Putin himself does not. I think the question is, what happens in a place like Russia if the president isn't popular? And I would argue that Putin and his administration, his government, worry far more about prospects of public unrest than they should, because historically the Russians might protest against specific policies, they might be angry about them, but there was a very big revolution a little over 100 years ago, and there was a very different sort of change about 30 years ago.
Can I just ask you this? Do you think he will still be there in 16 years after 36 years in power? Quickly from you, Olga, if you would, and then I'll go to you, Marko, for that one.
My money's on yes.
That was very quick. Marko, you think he'll be there in, 26?
I find that a little bit unlikely, but stranger things have happened. And if he's still doing a good job, then he should be there. And if there are, as Olga says, no natural replacements who'll serve Russia's interest as well as he has, then more power to his elbow. Let him stay on. Let's have a world of consensus and negotiation and stick to it.
I certainly wouldn't.
Thank you both. Oh, yes, quickly, Olga. Go on.
Look, I don't think it's a good thing for Russia, for Putin to stay on forever. I don't think it's been a good thing for Russia to have one president for all this time. Could it have been worse? Sure. Is change good? Also, yes, very much so.
Change.
So, I
okay, look, thank you. We are going to have to say thank you for the final time. Appreciate your views, both of you. Thank you, Olga. Thank you, Marko. Good to have you on Roundtable. Okay, time to welcome to the program former Russian diplomat Vyacheslav Matuzov. He's in Moscow, and in the UK, Victor Sebestyen, writer and historian on Russian affairs. Vyacheslav, let me come to you first of all. You are a seasoned diplomat. You are expert in Arabic, in world affairs. Do you think he has given Russia back its pride, or has his foreign policy at least been questionable?
Well, as far as our foreign policy is concerned, Russia really returned back to its role in world affairs. I think that now it is absolutely obvious in many regions in the world, in Middle East, in South America, in Far East, and even in Africa. So it is, on my opinion, it is natural role of the Russian Federation because it is, sometimes they consider that it is not, it is not world power. It is only regional power and so on. But I, all the time, 20 years after ruining the Soviet Union, I consider that it's impossible to diminish the weight and the geographical position of Russian Federation in the world map. If you look at between Pacific and between Baltic State, Northern Ocean, and Caspian Sea, Iranian, Turkey frontiers, so you cannot diminish this meaning of this country in the world affairs. Despite of all problems, of all difficulties inside, economical, social, and it was reflected, of course, during many years on our foreign policy, because previous president, it's Boris Yeltsin, and his foreign ministers that they change each other, Kozyrev, Primakov, and Ivanov, that before Lavrov were, I think they didn't pay any attention to world affairs.
Okay, so you think he has perhaps restored Russian pride in the way that he's handled international affairs? I want to go to Victor at this point. You'll have a chance to come back. Do you see anything that is very different in Putin? Obviously, a complete contrast to Yeltsin, but in the way that he runs Russia, is it any different to the Tsars, perhaps to the Soviets? I don't know.
Those around Putin would say he's changed everything, but actually everything stayed the same. And essentially, it is still the prison house of nations that it's all, that it historically it has been. He's turned essentially a one-party state, the Soviet state, into a one-clique state of people around him, and the oligarchs and the Siloviki, the old KGB security apparatus around him. Essentially, it is a one-voiced state. I think in the broad sweep of Russian history, Putin won't be looked at as a fantastic success. And for all the great power posturing that Russia has, its economy is barely bigger than Belgium's. It produces nothing.
Let me go back to Vyacheslav on this one. I looked at foreignpolicy.com, drew on some articles that have been written about Putin there. This is from Andrea Kendall-Taylor from the Center for New American Security. For the past 20 years, Putin has driven principally by his desire to maintain power. To this end, he has weakened the state, eliminated competition, and personalized Russia's political system. Life is not much fairer under Putin, she believes.
Well, in Russia, they consider, and the people on the street, as they say, they consider no changes, principal changes from Yeltsin's and the Putin's age, because economical life, it was only changing some faces. Instead of one oligarch, they brought another one. But previous oligarchs, now and the current oligarchs, all are residents of the Great Britain, mainly, or France, or Italy, and so on Switzerland. So I think that economical framework didn't change at all, only changed faces.
Okay, let me quote this to you, because it's interesting that it was Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the dissident Soviet a writer sent, of course, up to the gulags for his views. He was quite fulsome in his praise of Putin, said this: Putin inherited a ransacked and bewildered country with a poor and demoralized people, and he started to do what was possible, a slow and gradual restoration. These efforts were not noticed nor appreciated immediately. Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Victor, why would he be so fulsome in his praise of Putin?
Well, I mean, I think early on what Putin did do, and he's recognized very much for it and admired for it inside Russia, is that he did slightly he got rid of the absolute chaos of the immediate Soviet years that also took up the Yeltsin years. But if you take that on from solving that immediate thing, there are enormous problems in Russia that he hasn't really addressed. I mean, the main one, of course, is a catastrophically declining population rate. It's demographically a disaster zone, losing population by more than 1.5% a year, which is extremely dangerous.
Okay, Vyacheslav, why do you think Vladimir Putin wants to carry on for another 16 years?
Well, I personally doesn't like to stay here. If person work properly, he can stay any time. Look at Angela Merkel in Germany. She is the head of a German state 21 years.
Yeah, but she's going, and if he stays where he is, he will have been in that position of power, if not president, then prime minister, for 36 years.
The issue. Well, Putin is controversial problems here in Russia, of course, because quite a lot of people doesn't devote him. They don't believe he's making good things in our country for our people. And in spite of the successes, as we consider in the foreign policy, it is Middle East, it is on the world affairs, that he changed an image Russia into the world. He brought.
But if
Russia
at home, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but if at home you disagree with him, if you vocalize your criticism as Boris Nemtsov did, you tend to disappear.
No, Boris Nemtsov is not a respected person in Russia, like in Solzhenitsyn, I'm sorry. Because now they set up Solzhenitsyn's in Ryazan, I think, or some memorial.
But I'm saying if you criticize Vladimir Putin, you do so at your peril.
Well, we criticize Vladimir Putin strongly because of his internal economical, social policy. We cannot agree with him. It is quite a lot of points that he's losing. He is gaining some points in foreign affairs, in foreign policy, and he's losing all the time. What is concerned with our internal economical, social, and political life. So I think that the main problem for Putin is his behavior, his decisions that he could make after coronavirus entered this quarantine. I think that he is preparing some dramatical changes in government, in a country, the rulers of the regions, because we have...
Yes. Because, of course, and I'm going to throw this one to Victor, there have been criticisms that the Russian state has increased its surveillance of people under the excuse of tracking coronavirus, that it is actually looking at dissidents quite a lot.
I think that's fairly inevitably true. It wouldn't be the only autocratic leader in the world to be using this as a convenient excuse. But he doesn't really need to do that. At the moment, his position was and has been strong despite some domestic opposition, but they're facing considerable economic problems, serious problems, because of the crash.
And will that signal the end of Putin as a viable political figure?
Not necessarily. And it's very dangerous to predict in this area. All one does know historically is that when regime changes happen in Russia, they happen with astonishing speed and at unpredictable times, as has happened throughout their history. It's very, very dangerous to predict, and one would be foolish to predict that we would see the back of Putin.
Yeah. So another 16 years, maybe pushing it a little bit. Gentlemen, I have to thank you and say, look, sorry, this is the end of the program. I did want to mention just before we went that one thing for sure that has changed in the 20 years, I beg your pardon, since Vladimir Putin moved into the Kremlin, is that Russia's consumption of vodka has gone down apparently by 50%, but from an astronomical 2 billion litres a year to 1 billion, and that is still an awful lot of vodka. We appreciate your time. Thank you very much indeed. Good to have you on the program. From me, David Foster, from my guests on this program, we thank you for watching. We hope to have your company next time. Until then, goodbye.